Well, we'll get started then. Thank you, Ashley, for the introduction. Thanks for inviting me here. As Ashley mentioned, my name is Bert Spalding. I'm on the faculty at Wayne State University. I'm actually in the School of Business, where I teach ethics, forensic accounting, tax, and a few other things here and there. I'm also a faculty advisor for a campus apologetics group, a critical thinking club called Rochelle Christie. And you have a handout. On your handout you see the, actually, I don't know where all those handouts are, but let me grab one so I have one too. You may see up at the upper left the Rochelle Christie sort of logo, and then Wayne State. It's rochellechristie.org/WSU is the web address for that club, for our local club. I'm an attorney. I'm also happen to be a CPA, and I also am a bit of an ethicist proper. I have a PhD that primarily deals with Christian philosophy. My talk today, or presentation today, not really a discussion today, will be on the subject of inquisitiveness. Basically, that's the key theme. The title is "Seeking the Whole Truth: The Problem of Reductionism in Secularized Human Science." But what I'm interested in is truth-seeking. In law, we have, in litigation, we have varying standards of acceptance for purposes of accepting a proposition as being true. You're familiar with, in criminal setting, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. You have to prove something beyond a reasonable doubt. In some types of cases, it's a little lower standard called clear and convincing evidence. In most civil cases, it's by a preponderance of the evidence, or we could say more likely than not. That's the standard of proof. It's accepted as being true if the evidence is shown to be true more likely than not. Then in varying other kinds of cases, often penalty cases, sometimes sentencing types cases, there are even lower standards. So I was talking about levels of proof in law. And this really feels like a campfire setting. You know, it's like we, kumbaya, a little campfire here. In law, we talk about, beyond a reasonable doubt, clear and convincing evidence, more likely than not. Then in some penalty and sentencing type cases, we ask, well, the person blew it, especially in the area of tax, this is true. The person blew it, but was there at least some argument that could be made? Was there some kind of court case out there, or regulation, or some kind of what we call substantial authority? Even though they got it wrong, can we avoid some of the penalties because there was something else out there we can call substantial authority? And then below that is realistic possibility. Substantial authority is about 40% probability of winning the case. Realistic possibility is about a 1/3. Reasonable basis is about 1/4. And then below that, it's frivolous. That means there's really no basis in law for the position that was taken. Well, that's kind of helpful, at least I find it helpful, because when I talk about inquisitiveness, what we really want to do is we want to figure out how, to what extent can we accept a proposition of being true. So a lot of that involves how deep are we going to dig? And that's what we're going to talk about today, is how deep are we going to dig? Because what we want to talk about is human science in particular, but science proper. It involves digging, it involves gathering evidence. But it involves more than that. There is an intellectual engagement that's going on. And so we have evidence, but the question is, what do we do with that evidence? Do we follow the evidence wherever it leads? Or do we bring to our analysis of that evidence certain presuppositions that are going to limit the extent to which we're going to follow the evidence wherever it leads? Because we're going to layer over the top of it our own sort of matrix of presuppositions, and then that will determine how we're going to use that evidence. So inquisitiveness, there's an intellectual aspect. and it's intentional, it's volitional, it's ethical. In doing research, and you can think about medical research this way, if someone's doing medical research, there is an ethical duty, I'm going to say, there's an ethical duty to dig deep intentionally and follow the evidence where it goes. If you do anything less than that, you are limiting the potential outcome of that research. Does that make sense? Makes sense. You go where the evidence leads. In fact, we could say be a truth seeker. That's what science, that's what medical research involves, is truth seeking. Any questions, comments on that? All right. Well, in the world of science, including human science, but in the world of science proper, we kind of have a set of presuppositions that people do bring to their work, to their research. And much of the results of that research, which has become part of the body of knowledge, which is part of what you and I study as we go through various science and medical kinds of considerations. At one end, we have materialism, and my little laser isn't showing up, so I'll just use old school laser. One end, we have naturalism or materialism or physicalism, which for purposes of this very short little discussion, I'm going to use interchangeably. And what that basically is going to be presuming is that all that's there is that which is scientifically measurable. In other words, the only thing that is worth considering being out there, the only truth, if I may say, that can be expected to be found is truth that is mapped to evidence that is empirically ascertainable by, we could say, the 5 senses, or if you want to expand some, get into 6, 7, 8, 10 senses, talk about pain or heat or temperature, whatever. But we'll just say 5 senses. If you cannot access that data with 5 senses, with at least some of the 5 senses, and measure it, then it has no value. It has no place in science. How many have heard that type of articulation of what science is about and the role of science? How many of you have heard that? Okay. That is the prevailing set of presuppositions that you find in many of the journal articles that you read, even some of the textbooks that you read. That's the prevailing set of presuppositions. The other end of the spectrum is the supernaturalism. So we have naturalism, we have supernaturalism. Supernaturalism, it basically, you can have an extreme on either end, but the extreme on supernaturalism would have to be something like, if you could imagine just a really small child, maybe you have a younger sibling or a niece or nephew or someone that you know quite well who's 2 years old or 3 years old. And their imagination, it's all about imagination. Everything is imagination. And they're not hampered with, get up, I gotta get to class on time, I got this readings I gotta do. And, no, life is just wonderful. And if there's a problem, you just get a fairy princess and you wave a wand and you fix it, bling, and it's all fixed. You guys are looking at me like, man, that is so far removed from my reality. I can't even imagine thinking like that. But there is a greater willingness to adopt a sort of supernatural perspective on the part of small children. In fact, even Jesus said that true faith is faith like a child. Which would basically, is another way of saying that is, I keep waving my arms like this with a big circle. A child has a huge idea of God. It's an unlimited sense. A child can pray to God for anything. Lord, please make sure I get a Snickers bar for lunch tomorrow. I mean, anything. And we smile, isn't that cute? You know, like a puppy, you know, it's cute. But look what's going on is that child has this very open idea of the supernatural. In our reality, we see that a view of science is all there is that which is physical. Often contains a skepticism about God. In other words, a sense that, well, if it's all physical, God's not physical, so we're not going to deal with God. God either doesn't exist or it doesn't matter if God exists. We're just going to ignore that as we go about our business. The other end of the spectrum is skepticism towards science. And by that I mean a predisposition towards science that would say, you need to really prove your point. And for those who get advanced degrees and PhDs and do advanced research in any area of science, they have to make a proposition, they have to develop a hypothesis, usually it's a null hypothesis, and then they have to provide empirical data and an analysis of that data that would either show that hypothesis to be true or false. And then that is subjected to peer review and a lot of criticism and a lot of critique. Often they'll present a paper. In some of the research I do, I love going and presenting papers to other faculty members in my disciplines, and I do it so that I get blowback. I want critique. If somebody says, "Oh, that was really great," it was a waste of my time. I wasted the travel time, the hotel time, the whole thing was a waste. But if I get blowback, if I get critique, if I get hammered, now I'm getting something of value that I can make notes of and go back and make sure and study. And that's what a skeptical view toward science, not about science, but toward science, yields. It yields better science, basically. All right. So we can have one end have what we could call a materialist reduction, which wants to reduce everything down to a material, natural, or physical realm. And you could have the other end, an aesthetic reduction, which basically would say, and then there are some weird philosophies. I don't know if it was a while ago now, but if you remember the movie The Matrix. How many actually remember that old movie? Okay. About half, which is better than I expected. But that actually follows an even earlier philosophical puzzle called Brain in a Vat. Which asks whether or not you could just hook up your brain and you live your life and just be perfectly happy, and everything would go actually perfectly. The lights would stay on, everything would just be perfect in the brain in the vat. But it's really not a real experience. It's all sensory kinds of things. So the aesthetic reduction, which we don't get very often because we don't think like little children. We're adults. We have to get to school on time and get to class on time and do things. But there is reductionism at either end. What we want to talk about today, though, is let's see here, is truth-seeking and optimal truth-seeking. Is there a way to sort of sort out materialism / naturalism / physicalism? Is there a way to sort of sort that out with supernaturalism and ask, well, how is it that we can open up our inquisitiveness to have the optimal sort of truth-seeking? Any questions, comments on any of that? You guys are doing great. All right. Now, in order to think about this question, okay, is optimal truth-seeking is really, do I want to take this and say I want to skew it over this way, so the bell curve is way over here on the materialism side, is it over here on this side, or is there some balance between the two? In order to sort that out and sort of figure out how to make sense of that, I want to kind of go through a thought process of what's out there, okay? Otherwise known as ontology, but what's out there, and what do we believe about what's out there? Now, this comes from Aristotle. This goes back a ways. And so when you hear the word metaphysical, sometimes that's an unfamiliar word, but if you just sort of lay it, whoops, I went too far. You lay it next to the word physical. And metaphysical just means that there's the physical stuff that's out there, and then there's other stuff. It's almost like if you ran a substance through a centrifuge, and you separated out the solids from everything else. And we would call the physical would be the solids, and then whatever else is out there, whatever else is in that substance would be from the centrifuge, would be separated out. This is the Aristotelian notion of physical versus metaphysical. And the physicalist, naturalist, materialist view would a proper way of understanding it is saying, this is all there is. There really isn't anything metaphysical. Okay? Now, what's wrong with that statement? The claim that all there is that which is physical. What's wrong with that statement? I just came here for the lunch, and lunch not even here yet. Please.
There are a lot of things you cannot explain with the physical.
Okay.
For instance, dreams.
Dreams, thank you. Dreams. You can't explain dreams with the physical. Now, in cognitive neuroscience, on the science side, and in philosophy of mind, on the philosophy side, there will be arguments that would say dreams are just juices and synapses in our wetware, because we are just moist robots, we're just physical. And dreams are just juices and synapses in our wetware, in our brain, that are going on and triggering things that we think of as dreams. But it's just all physical. Now, so that's an argument that's made, but I think you're closer to the truth, that there's something metaphysical going on, especially in old school, especially when, oh look, you can make little lines, that's pretty cool. Especially when easily distracted, could I say. Oh look, a squirrel, no. That especially when dreams come true or dreams are informative, it's difficult for us to say that dreams are nothing more than random disorder that's going on in our mind. What else can we say? Yes?
Yeah, so like a lot of these issues, that statement is
Thank you.
itself a non-physical statement.
Thank you.
Physical or metaphysical.
Thank you. That's it. Actually, I learned this stuff from John, so he's helping me. No, that claim, you're absolutely, John's absolutely right. The claim that all there is physical is not supported by physical. It's an idea. It's an abstract philosophical claim. There's nothing physical about it. 2 and 2 is not physical. 2 carpet tiles and 2 carpet tiles are physical carpet tiles, but the mathematics, 2 plus 2, is itself not physical. And Plato had a lot to do with that. He talked about what is real and what is not real. He talked in his Socratic dialogues. Socrates talked about a triangle. So you could draw a triangle. You could draw a right triangle, and that's chalk on blackboard or whatever. And the chalk dust is physical, but the triangle is actually more real. The idea of the triangle, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, the formula for a right triangle, is actually more real than the chalk. The chalk's not perfect. Now, today with computers with single pixels, we can get pretty close to a perfect right triangle. But it's mathematically derived. So mathematics would be an example, logic would be an example, claims about what is would be an example of the metaphysical. Any questions or comments on that? So when a scientist says that all there is physical, that's actually a self-defeating statement. Because for that to be true, his statement would have to, or her statement would have to be false. Okay? So materialism is the a priori view that only matter is reality, and that a proper perspective of reality is reduced to the material, and that's actually our definition for today. There's a number of ways of talking about reductionism, but for today, that's our definition of reductionism. That a proper perspective of reality is reduced to the material. Any questions, comments on that? Now, let me go back and talk real quickly about the metaphysical. Epistemology in the world of philosophy is the sort of asks the question, how do we know what we know? And so in epistemology, there are a number of things that we know that we don't get from science. We've already talked about logical truths like making a claim. So logical and mathematical truths, we don't get those from science. Metaphysical truths, ethical beliefs, what is right and what is wrong. Science can't tell us that. Science can give us lots of abilities to do a lot of things, but whether those things are right or wrong, science can't tell us that. that we bring that, through our volition, we bring that to the process. Aesthetic judgments, what's beautiful? Science itself cannot be proven by science, because the claim of science, that all truth is from science, is a metaphysical claim that cannot be proved by science. Are you okay with all this? This is really kind of scratched. I just want to know what's on the test. No, this is not that kind of class. Okay, it's not even a class. All right. So what's out there now? Epistemology is how we know what we know, and one of the things that a follower of Christ, one who has reached a point where they realize that God is out there, and God is really huge, and God is really holy. And in the presence of a huge and awesome and holy God, I got nothing. I'm in trouble. And so a follower of Christ is one who is locked on to and bought into and accepted and gone into a relationship with Jesus Christ, the Son of God, in order to have a relationship with a holy God that can only happen through Jesus Christ. They can't do it on their own. For that person, who then discovers through the Holy Spirit just a lot of awesome things that are in the Bible, when they are reading Proverbs, they find out that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of all knowledge, and the fear of the Lord is the beginning of all, what's the other one? Wisdom. Yeah, who said that? You did. All right. Oh, it was up there. Good man. Way to go. All right. Okay. There are advantages to being right in the front row. I want to tell you. You can see the screen before anybody else does. Okay. Was that a material claim? Was that a metaphysical claim? All right. It is true that the regenerated follower of Christ, regenerated by the Holy Spirit, gets to see things that a non-believer doesn't get to see. And that's a whole wonderful discussion that we could have at another time. But we're just going to leave that there for now to say that spiritual awakening, spiritual life through becoming a follower of Christ enables us to see things and understand things and apply those understandings and see how those things apply in our lives in ways that non-believers do. So there's a spiritual way of knowing, there's an empirical knowledge way of knowing, and when you combine that with reason, you basically have science. Number 2 and number 3 are science. Data, facts are gathered and they're studied and they're analyzed, but there's also intuition. Some would claim that, some social scientists would claim that nonverbal communication is about 80% in most circumstances. Creativity, speculative philosophy. These are all things that do not, that we don't get those out of a lab study that's been set up ahead of time with protocols. They just, boom, show up, kind of like dreams. They happen. And then authority. Most everything we know from authority. In fact, the sentence that I just said, most everything we know from authority. The only reason that you understand that sentence is because somewhere along the line you learned English. You didn't learn English from yourself. You learned English from others, from your parents, family, school, so on, so on, so on. From others. The very meaning of words you learn from others. And so language, as we know, there's a cultural content to language and cultural dimension to language, but that's part of the authority. So most of what we know we get from people, from books, from traditions, from protocols, and so on. So that's how we know what we know. Any questions on that? Well, let's cycle back to what's out there. What we said is what was out there is physical. We've also said that we have to apply a certain amount of logic to it. But then we were talking briefly about dreams, and we're talking about the mind. We talked about the mind in the vat. How many have, in some of your classes or elsewhere, wrestled with the sort of dualism idea of brain and mind versus just the idea that all there is your brain as complex? How many have run into that discussion? A few of you have, okay. It shows up in cognitive neuroscience, it shows up in philosophy of mind, it shows up in a number of places, it shows up in Bible studies sometimes. And so scientific materialism, physicalism, and naturalism would say all there is the brain. But philosophy of mind would not be so sure. Philosophy of mind would ask about that and then would look at the neuroscience that goes along with it and ask the question, is your mind your brain? And your brain, of course, like all of our cells, reproduces itself and replaces. The cells are replaced, and somehow or another, everything carries forward neatly. Thoughts are immaterial. Brains are immaterial. Thoughts are subjective. Thoughts are volitional. We decide, we bring a willfulness to everything we do. And that willfulness defines who we are. The decisions and the willfulness, the intentionality that we bring to bear, it defines who we are. And then there's a fair amount of science, and I'll be delighted to go over some of this if you ask questions and answers, but there's a fair amount of science that deals with mind over matter, brain over matter, and how we can make decisions, whether it's to learn to play the piano or learn to read better and have better comprehension when we're reading, or we choose to take on a sport. Any number of things, we pay attention to what we take in. There's been a lot of thoughts. Do we need to stop for a couple minutes, or just we could? Okay, I'm the entertainment. You guys just eat. This is wonderful. This is great. No, this is great. It doesn't bother me. It's just great. It was going to make me kind of wonder about hunger versus food and which one is metaphysical, but I'm not going to worry about that too much. Even some of the recent studies where they've studied people that find themselves in habitual use of pornography and discovery that actually can affect the way the brain operates. So there is a lot of, these two bullets go together very closely. We can make decisions, and those decisions that we make mindfully, I'm using that word very, very carefully, the decisions that we make mindfully can actually affect the physics, the physiology of our brain. Any questions on that, comments on that? Our knowledge and our presumptions are not physical, and our wisdom, which is part of the volition, how we take what we know and we apply it to the circumstances. We make decisions about habits and disciplines and everything else. How many pieces of pizza, all those kinds of things. So mind-brain therapies verified by brain scans, I've mentioned a few. These are some of them. You may have run into them in some of your studies. Depression and sadness, Tourette's syndrome, stroke rehabilitation, focal hand dystonia, dyslexia, panic disorder, spider phobia, stress reduction, follow-up care for cancer patients, mind-based cognitive talk therapies can actually have physical results. And so we look at that and it helps us think through a little bit about the dualism of mind versus brain. Any questions, comments on that? So we have in our little question, what's out there, we have the physical, then we have logic or reasoning, and we basically said you kind of have to think of these together in science, but true materialistic, naturalistic, physicalistic science would actually draw a line right there and say it's just all physical. So we talked about logic, we talked about brain, about the mind. It's time to talk about what else is out there. Because one of the key questions, where does this all come from? Why is there something instead of nothing? Why is there pizza instead of nothing? Why is there me instead of nothing? Or you? Why does anything exist? And science doesn't have a pathway to an answer as long as it is welded to materialism, naturalism, and physicalism. It doesn't have a pathway to an answer because existence itself, being itself, precedes materialism. And so the cause of being, the cause of existence, if you think through it logically, would have to be immaterial or metaphysical, would have to be unchanging, so that there could be, if you could call it a creative process, have to be objective because it is external to that entity that is all of existence. Has to invite science, would have to create decide to create a cosmos that invites investigation, that does not discourage investigation, that invites learning, and there would be a mind. And in Romans 1:18-20, it talks about how nature displays the attributes of God. This is the 21st century unpacking of that claim. Because when we unpack what it means that there can be something instead of nothing, we wind up with asking about, you would necessarily have to have these very characteristics. Most especially a mind, most especially an entity who chooses to create, which would be a person. And so we end up with what's called the inference to the best explanation being God. Now, when I get to this point in this presentation or any kind of presentation, I just want to stop and I want to explain something. Christians are weenies. I'm sorry, it's just true. They're weenies. They're wimps. We think that somehow or another we have to convince the non-believer that you have all this that exists, and so you have to ask a question and you have to display the inductive evidence of God, design and beauty and greatness and smallness and the crossover between matter and energy at the subatomic level. And we think that we have to sort of make the case so that the scientists will go, oh yeah, okay, I guess that's plausible. The problem is the evidence is so there. In fact, that's what Romans 1:18, in Romans 1:18-20, when it says that nature reveals the attributes of God, you know what it says? It says there's no such thing as an agnostic. The word agnostic means you don't have the information. Romans 1:20 says, no. The information's plenty there. So there's no such thing as an agnostic. And what is an atheist? An atheist is one who has staked a claim on the absence of God. So they're not only ignoring the information that's there, but they're staking a claim against that information. So we need to stop, as followers of Christ, we need to stop sounding apologetic. Frankly, I'll say it as it is, because the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Atheism, as it says in Proverbs, or as in the Psalms, a fool says in his heart, there is no God. And I don't use that word, to say an atheist is a fool as a person. I'm just saying the atheist's claim that there is no God is a foolish claim. It's it's ignoring the evidence. And that's okay. It makes perfectly good sense. I got one more little rant, and then I'll go back to the slides. It's a real simple rant. It makes perfectly good sense for an atheist to make the claim that there is no God, because an atheist is going to rely, a materialist, naturalist, physicalist, atheist, whether they're a scientist or not, but the atheist is relying on random disorder. Random disorder is the origin of everything. Well, if that's the case, then nothing the atheist can say needs to make any sense. There's no need for it to make sense, because it's all random disorder anyway. And so it's all absurd. So if it's all absurd, there's no real obligation to follow the evidence using an atheistic philosophical approach. Any questions on that? Okay, so I'm not trying to be mean or whatever. So, some of my best friends are atheists. Actually, I'll be debating a good friend, I think in February, maybe at Lawrence Tech, who's an atheist. But the atheist position is absurd, and actually that's not even an insult. That's just accepting the claims that are made by atheists about absurdity. Any questions, comments on that? All right, so in the metaphysical range of what's out there, we have logic and reasoning. And I could use reasoning, I could use logic and mathematics. I just like the word logic because it kind of reminds us of the word what in the Bible? Logos. It kind of reminds us of the word logos. And mind, which is, we map that to soul, we map that to personhood, and God. So, that's just another view of what's out there. Now, let me kind of ask a weird question. I don't know what I just did, but I'll go right there. Right there. What's wrong with my model here? This is actually a defective model. What's wrong with it? Yeah, go ahead.
Just separate them all into separate categories.
That's exactly right. Thank you. What's your name? Patrick. Patrick's exactly right. Since you didn't have this before, I figured that's why you didn't have the answer, because you like to know ahead of time. So. Patrick's actually exactly right. And by the way, we weenie Christians often find ourselves trying to walk this pathway to God, trying to walk a non-believer through this pathway to God. And you know what we're doing? We're playing on their turf. Because those categories themselves are not linear. That's kind of what you were trying to say. They don't line up in a linear basis. And that God is not something, you add on to mind, which is something you add on to logic, which is something you add on to physical. So let me go through these three things one more time, and I got a bow to wrap it up. And I don't know how long John, how am I doing? Have I got another 10 minutes or so, or?
Oh, yeah.
You can't go.
12:30.
So 4:30, good. We'll be. All right. So let me kind of go back through, and I guess I'm not going to ask this as a question. Sometimes I would, but if all there is physical. I think we could safely say that's really not science, because we haven't brought any intellectual engagement with that which is physical. This chair is physical, but we're not noticing a whole lot of intellectual activity going on inside of this chair. Might be, and we can't deny that the physical is, in the world of God, we can't deny that the physical can at some time have some kind of animation. We read in the Bible that if Jesus is not acknowledged properly, the rocks will cry out. But that's kind of a long way off from the claim made by atheist scientists, which is what we're going to call radical reductionism, versus what I'm going to call in a minute reduction 2.0. Just as a quick review. I'm doing a quick review and then I'll go on. So materialism, natural physics, materialism is the view that only matter is reality. Scientific materialism adds that the scientific method is the only right path to truth. Well, the scientific method is metaphysical, but be that as it may. Materialism also incorporates a modified form of reductionism, which is the view that all laws and theories are reducible to laws of physics and chemistry. But then we have to ask, where did those laws come from? And to be fair, and I've had this conversation with atheists, including atheist scientists, and the best answer that I've heard is, I don't worry about it. Just to look the other way, doesn't matter. Nothing to see here. Laws of physics, laws of chemistry, biological kinds of laws, we could call them. All of these things. Nothing to see here. Don't ask where they came from. Just make good use of them. And frankly, that pragmatic approach, where we don't really ask where it all comes from, it kind of works well. It yields a lot of good medicine. But the problem is that when that medicine and that science is packaged up with materialistic atheism, which is not what was used in order to create that medicine, because we had to use logic and reasoning and mind, then it becomes, basically it's false advertising, false packaging. All actions can be explained by material parts. And then we have Reductionism 2.0, which is where we actually add logic. Now here's the difference, Patrick, between what we had before. To the extent that there's anything physical that for me to even access anything physical, for me to even stomp on this floor, to access anything physical, there has to be some intellectual interaction. And for it to be science. So reductionism 2.0 is that we just go with logic, but we don't ask where it came from. Okay. The next level is the mind, and of course the mind makes use of the logic in order to analyze that which is physical. And so really the best science is the mind making use of logic and applying that to that which is physical. That's better science. Any questions on that? And just so we can round this off, here's the question. Maybe the best science is to be mindful of all the supernatural possibilities that are there when one thinks about a creative, engaged, sustaining God. Any questions, comments on that? So that kind of opens it up even more. And the other thing, of course, where do we get the mind? We get the mind from God. In fact, not only do we get the mind from God, but a follower of Christ wants to go one better and wants to have the mind of who? The mind of Christ in the New Testament. You surprised me with that one. You didn't give me an advance notice, and it wasn't there. Sorry, No. The New Testament calls upon us to have the mind of Christ. Well, who was the smartest man that ever walked the face of the earth? I'm going to say Christ. Jesus Christ was. Of course, Jesus Christ was also God. So our goal then is to seek the mind of God and to have the mind of Christ. Any questions, comments on that? All right. Here's my ribbon. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so Bert, just a quick question
Yeah.
or a comment.
Yeah.
So one of the reasons why the incarnation has been so vital to the Christian faith is because of this marriage between the divine God
Yes.
and the physical.
Yeah.
So you see this brought together
Yeah.
perfectly, and it's in so many levels why Christians say, to look at Christ is both to look at God
Yes.
perfectly and also
Right.
to look at humanity perfectly.
Right. Okay. 4:30, right? Because I got it. You're right, John. Here's something Augustine came upon. Augustine, 5th century, Augustine. He said, God spoke the cosmos into existence. He didn't use the word cosmos, but he spoke the universe into existence. Okay. Think about what it means to speak the universe into existence. Put aside Francis Collins and the language of God and the alphabet of DNA replication and how that actually is a logical language. Put aside the cosmological constant, which brings a fine tuning at the atomic level all the way to the expansion of the universe, and all of the other 120 cosmological laws that are part of the universe. Put those all aside for a minute. Put them aside. What happens when God speaks? When God speaks, he breathes a word, and then he breathes another word, and he breathes another word. Let there be. Okay? Now, when he is doing that, he's not only creating all that is material, Augustine wanted to say, he's creating time. God is timeless. But you cannot have a spoken word without having that go through time. Words are spoken through time. So when God spoke, he created time. There was time and matter and a future, the future of all that he created. And so when When John tells us in John 1:1 that Jesus is the Logos, Jesus are the very Word, and we see that in other places. Jesus is the Word of God. Jesus is the essential embodiment of the creation of all that is. Isn't that amazing? I think so. I don't get out much, so I give myself permission to be amazed at things. I just think that's really amazing. Okay. Any questions? Any other questions, comments? Thank you, John. Please, please, please.
Going back to the previous slide,
Please, yes.
I have heard a lot of atheists during debates, they
Yes.
say if God is a benevolent God, as
Right.
he's portrayed to be,
Right.
then why are all these natural laws,
Right.
like earthquake, why
Right.
do they actually happen?
Right.
And by occurring, they destroy the same work of God,
Right.
including evil.
Right.
How do you
Yeah.
address that?
Such a great question, and it's really, I could spend another 4 hours on that. But you're pointing to, thank you for pointing to, you're pointing to the problem of evil. And I want to tell you that anybody who wants to examine the claims of any faith, whether it's Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, it doesn't matter. Anybody who wants to examine the claims of any religious expression or any faith needs to deal with that very question. That's one of the things that has to be addressed in any pursuit of what it means to understand God. So it's not just the Christian God. Anybody who wants to be a believer has to address that. And the other side of that very coin is the only faith system that provides the answer is Judeo-Christian faith. And let me explain. I'm going to give you the short version, which is only going to take 28 minutes. So it's a short version. Take less than that. But what happened at the fall? What does the Bible tell us that happened at the fall? Well, obviously, Adam and Eve sinned. What were some of the consequences of that? Anybody remember?
The ground was cursed.
The ground was cursed, and death entered in. Okay. We also see, even in Cain and Abel, when Abel was killed by Cain, and God says, the earth is crying out. And when we look at all of the sin, all of the bloodshed, frankly, all the abortions, all of the cruelty that happens, and blood drains into the earth, and the earth cries out. Earth really basically wants to puke out a gag reflex to all of the sin that occurs. And that's a way of understanding the earth you're not going to find anywhere else. But so it really makes you think that God created Adam and Eve. He gave them free will. He gave them true free will, which means they have the opportunity to reject God. And that's what they did. They said, well, yeah, I want to be God. I want to decide right and wrong. I want to figure this out for myself. That's what atheism is. Atheism is I want to decide. I am God. Atheism really isn't atheism. Atheism is metheism. There is a God. It's just me instead of another God. So that's part of the answer. Part of the answer is how big this box is compared to the rest of these. Most of the time, whether it's the problem of evil or other questions, when you see these debates, unfortunately, in many cases, it's both sides. Both sides are talking about God. The atheist or the non-believer's idea of God is often a caricature. You know what's embarrassing is when atheists like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Daniel Dennett, they write these books just slamming Christianity. They haven't bothered to learn about Christianity. They haven't actually studied it. They don't even know what they're talking about. They present a caricature of Christianity. So you have that side having a caricature of who God is. And then the other side, whose idea of God is back to the linear thing that Pat and I decided didn't make any sense at all. In other words, they've got a small God. And you've got no God and small God, and then you wonder why you can't figure out the problem of evil. And that's very often underlying the problem. But thank you so much. You're absolutely right. That's a key question for any belief system. Good. Any others? All right. Let me kind of get to my ribbon. This is my ribbon where I kind of wrap things up a little bit. And what I've been kind of pointing to today, and again, remember I said we're talking about inquisitiveness and truth-seeking. I'm trying to encourage us to be much more intentional about truth-seeking and inquisitiveness, and frankly, study. And in the process, I want to remind us that very often, in apologetics in particular, we want to approach apologetics from this end. And we want to say, if we're going to kind of move toward an optimal truth-seeking, we want to start with faith as the product of understanding. If I could just learn enough about intelligent design, just learn enough about the history of Christianity, just learn enough about the extra-biblical corroboration for the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, just have enough external evidence for the reliability of the New Testament with the tens of thousands of manuscripts that go back to the 1st and 2nd century. If I could just do a data dump and get this non-believer to look at everything, you know what? They don't want to look at it. They've chosen not to. And 1 Corinthians 1 and 18 and going on into 1 Corinthians 2 tell us it's all foolish. The things of God are foolishness to the fallen person. So we're trying to walk them from their turf into an understanding of the supernatural. What happened in the Middle Ages, in the pre-modern times, that in these postmodern days we're finding ourselves circling back to, which is what I'm doing right here today. Circling back to is to go back to say, wait a minute, God is huge and His mind informs my mind, His grace informs my life, His omniscience and His omnipotence sustains the universe. Not only is He the creator, He sustains the universe. I just need to have a bigger idea of who God is. And a greater confidence of the Word of God was going to come with that naturally. And as that happens, I'm going to find myself moving in this direction and find that faith is the basis for understanding, which has historically been the case. You know, science grew up out of Christianity. Science didn't grow up out of atheism. Faith is the basis for understanding. And what does that mean, though? That means there's a gap here. And there's only one way to fill the gap. It's called the gospel. That's it. Because the gospel we're commissioned to proclaim the good news of the life, death, resurrection, and kingdom of Jesus Christ. And when we do that, we're speaking to unregenerate non-believers. Yes, we can answer their questions, whether it's the problem of evil or any other. We can disabuse them of some of the mythology that they have come to know. But if we take the tack that we're trying to talk them through and convince them of the supernatural claims of all that is out there in God, we may be overstepping our commission. Our commission is to preach the gospel and allow the Holy Spirit to be involved, and in 1 Peter 3:15, to give an answer for the hope, to account for the hope that is within me. And that's the role that we're called to play. But in the meantime, what I've tried to do today is I've tried to say, hey, look, understand, don't be embarrassed, don't be shy, don't be a weenie, don't buy into this thing that you're kind of bucking up against the system of science. The system of science have got these pillars and these huge temples, and we're kind of walking around in it, especially as we're in medical school, dental school. We're kind of walking around in the temples of science. Don't be intimidated. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. You actually are smarter than any non-believer you've ever met. Now, that sounds like an arrogant thing to say. It's just what the Bible says. That we understand that as grace, and we understand that as humility. Because it's with humility when we're bringing the gospel to a non-believer, we're basically retelling our own story. I was lost and in desperate need for a Savior. And apologetics is two conversations. It's head-to-head and it's heart-to-heart. The actual, all of this talk about, moral argument and this argument and that argument, that's all, I call it background noise. What's really going on is my heart. If I'm reaching out to a non-believer and I understand how desperately lost they are, even if they don't understand it, then I'm going to be reaching out in love. And it may be that I never get very far in some of the conversations, but I can sure have some coffee or some pizza or whatever and have a relationship with that person and be a living epistle in that person's life. And that's more important than how clever I am at making arguments to refute their arguments. So seeking the whole truth, the problem of reductionism is that it puts blinders on, it limits us, or atheist scientists in particular, it limits them to all that is out there and the basis for all that is out there. And when we understand that, we can relax, have a little more confidence, and be much better prepared to give an account for the hope that lies within us. Any questions, comments, please? Allison.
So does this go with a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about, like there is a God that creates the world and whatnot, I feel like that can be applied to different religions as well, like just taking out the materialism. And a lot of science came through the Middle East and Islam. Right. And so do you believe that it's just, I agree, like Christianity has like why we're here, resurrection, whatnot, but like how do other religions apply to this?
Actually, it's a great question. And if you dig deep enough, Islam actually being aside, that much of the science that came through was actually a rediscovery of Western science, especially from Aristotle, that was brought back into Europe by way of Islam, especially through Spain. And they did have a golden era, but there was a time in the Second Caliphate. I don't want to get too much into history, where there was a development, this idea of what we were talking about here, bringing reason to bear on the Quran and on the study of science. And all of the leaders of that Mutazilite group were beheaded. And Al-Ghazali was a Muslim scholar who changed all of that. And he basically said, that God not only sustains the universe, but God intervenes at every level. So if you light a match, the cotton wick would not light, but for the fact that God jumped in the middle and caused it to light. So he removed the ideas of cause and effect, and he inserted God. So there's a lot of confusion in Islamic science that's occurred as a result of that. All that said, if you look at the larger view of Hinduism, and you look at the sort of the trinity of gods that is there, the further you dig into these major religions, the larger God gets in those religions. So this notion of discovering Romans 1:20, when Romans 1:20 says the attributes of God, someone could find a Hindu God, the attributes of a Hindu God. In other words, there's a deity there. That's why the non-believer can see the attributes of God, but has to hear the gospel. The gospel is what clears the air and say, okay, now let's look at what the truth is, and there's the moral content of God's holiness and redemption, which is not found anywhere else. You find God's holiness in Islam, you don't find redemption. You do not find holiness in the pantheistic expressions. So what happens is the gospel sort of clears the air. You've got the attributes of God. Now the gospel shows you who that God really is and why and how it relates to me personally as a sinner. So thank you. I hope that answered your question. I hope I didn't overstate the answer. I wanted to answer directly what you asked. Thank you. Any other questions? Bring them on. Hit me.
Kurt,
Yeah.
Can you speak for a second on how you see the problem of reductionism at work in your field or fields in business or in law? And if you've had any thoughts on the practical cost of that in
Yeah.
those fields or in medicine?
Yeah. Let me talk about medicine first, and it's really something that I didn't think we'd have enough time to go into. But neuroscience is the crossover point in the brain-mind thing, and that in our little sort of boxes that we've been using, we put mind there, and I talked a little bit about it. But neuroscience is really the lightning rod for that whole discussion in science. In philosophy, it's philosophy of mind. And actually, they talk to each other. Cognitive neuroscience and philosophy of mind, they have conferences and they talk to each other. There's a lot of scholarship that goes back and forth, published in each other's journal. In fact, there was a neuroscience conference up in Flint recently that had a lot of philosophers there. So this whole notion of mind, and a lot of it has to do with the list that I gave you, but a lot of it has to do with some of the really outrageous things that came out of Richard Dawkins' God Delusion, and some of the other things he wrote, where he basically created this model of the brain. He said that the people believe in God because children growing up, there is an evolutionary programming for children to pay attention to what their parents teach them. And so, and they survive better if they basically adopt their parents' beliefs, in an evolutionary, that helps them survive. And so when parents teach them about God, then they believe that because that fits into that paradigm. Of course, it took a couple debates later for somebody to ask Richard Dawkins to say, well, so then everything you believe came from your parents. So it's to say, how can we believe anything you say then? Yours is just an evolutionary drippings of brain matter going on, being programmed ahead of time too. So why would you saying there is no God have any credibility? But coming out of that sort of blast of really weak arguments scientifically and philosophically from some of these new atheists, that has actually created a greater interest in neuroscience and cognition, and that's why I showed you some of the things there. And there's just a lot of literature on that. I would love to be able to go walk through some of that literature. In my field, basically I'm an ethicist, and in my field, the question is, how do you know right from wrong? How do you know right and wrong? If it's all material, that's not even a question. That question makes no sense in materialism. And yet, the interesting thing about it is, when I do a lot of seminars, professional ethics seminars, and when I'm in a room with a bunch of professionals, they don't have very much confusion about right and wrong. And that's, I think, true of the population at large, but in professionals in particular. Why? Because professionals understand that they're looked at and judged by society. Society thinks that it owns professionals because it gave the professionals their licenses. And so society has expectations of professionals, and if they don't live up to those expectations, it's called malpractice. And it gets real ugly real fast. So there is a natural concern about getting it right, literally, among professionals. But that's a very pragmatist approach. It's not very satisfying at the personal level. And so at the personal level, physicalism, naturalism, it's just random. It's random disorder. It doesn't yield any sense of right and wrong. But most people have a sense of right and wrong. They may not have a very strong sense, and you mentioned relativism. They may not have a very strong sense of it. It may be squishy. It may not have any clear parameters and guardrails, but they still have a sense there's something out there that's right and wrong, and they want to figure that out. That's not physicalism. That's something else. That's getting into logic. It's getting into the mind. So those are two areas that I think that I bumped into anyway. Thank you, John. Any other questions, comments? Yes, please.
Wouldn't a lot of people argue that that's like a evolutionary impulse or continuation of a social species?
Yeah, that's a good point. Here's the thing. let's just think about this for a second. When we look at the animal world, when you can look at the lions, whatever, when somebody killed a lion recently, they killed a white-maned lion in Africa, and everybody's all upset, whatever. Okay. When a lion, an alpha male lion, is killed, what does the new incoming alpha male want to do to all the progeny of the previous alpha male? Kill them all. Kill all the babies. Kill them all. One of the things about evolution is that the preservation of the gene pool or the gene strain is done by strength and by numbers. Now, social evolutionists have a lot of problems with that because the most successful people in society tend to have fewer kids. And when you take that reality and you move it backwards, we don't get, in the history of humankind, we don't get patterns of behavior that support the evolutionary model. That's not how we got here. In the history of, if you look at anthropology and you look at the sociology over history, we didn't get here through an evolutionary model of conquering and strength being the result of the best pool. We tried to do that about 50 years, 175 years ago. It's called eugenics, which was done in Germany, which actually, they got that model from, unfortunately, some intellectual activity and judicial cases here in the United States. That's not how history has panned out. So one answer to that is the evolutionary model doesn't explain human history. It just doesn't. The other thing that it does though is it doesn't explain much of human behavior. It doesn't explain the altruism. It doesn't explain the creativity. It doesn't explain the decisions of people to take themselves out of the gene pool process for religious purposes or for other purposes. So it's an inadequate explanation. It's a proposition that's made, but the data doesn't support it very well. So when you can say, well, I can look at the data and I could come to either conclusion, I could find enough evidence that, what you're talking about is inference to the best explanation. That's the abduction. That's the analysis of the data, and there goes the battery, so that means I'm about done. The inference to the best explanation, I can look at the data and I can arrive at one conclusion. Somebody else can look at the data and look at another conclusion. It's what we bring to our analysis of the data that is determinative. So if I am a follower of Christ and I look at the data and I say, well, this is just telling me that sin nature is that's the genetic problem. It's sin nature. I'm going to come to that conclusion. Somebody else, an evolutionary biologist or sociologist, might want to look at the data and come to a different conclusion. We're each bringing our presuppositions. We're bringing our lenses to study the data. The data itself doesn't yield a dominant answer one way or the other. So it's really what I bring to it, which kind of gets us back to how we started out today. I think the pizza is gone, the electricity is gone. Actually, I'm really kind of surprised the cucumbers and celery and carrots are still there. Apparently you thought I needed those instead of pizza. So that's fine. I want to thank you, John, Allison, the other officers. Thank you for inviting me and really appreciate being here.